In the King James Version of 1 Peter 2, verse 9, Peter tells the church they are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a peculiar people. And I remember sitting in church services, usually in a sermon about being in but not of the world, when preachers would pull out this particular translation and relish saying that word, peculiar. I didn't want to be peculiar, but I did want to follow Jesus, and that didn't seem entirely normal. And when I looked at the early church in the Bible, they seemed downright weird. And the guest for this episode of TheoDisc, Dr Nijay Gupta, would say that weirdness was actually what made the early church attractive. Nijay's latest book, Strange Religion, talks about how the first Christians were weird, dangerous, and compelling. And we spoke together about how understanding the way they navigated their world with the message of the gospel can help us in our present time and cultures. Nijay holds a PhD in New Testament from Durham University and is Professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. He's co-host of the Slow Theology podcast and has written multiple books including Tell Her Story, Paul and the Language of Faith, and several commentaries. He's also a senior translator for the New Living Translation. I hope you enjoy our conversation about the strange religion called Christianity. Well, Dr. Nijay Gupta, it is wonderful to have you on the TheoDisc podcast. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, glad to be here with you, Kenny.
Yeah, great. So we're going to be talking about your latest book at the moment, which is just fresh in the UK in publication. But before we get into talking about what that is, every person who comes on the TheoDisc podcast has to run the gauntlet of 3 questions so we can get to know you a little bit more. And then you can get onto your theology stuff after that. So the 3 questions are about things that are constants, things that you return to. And so the first one is, what is a book that you return to?
Yeah, that's an easy one. I always, the immediate thing that came to mind is Michael Gorman's book, Cruciformity, which is 20 years old. But I first read it in seminary. It blew my mind, and it's in a new edition now. And I can't imagine a book I recommend more to people than that book. Have you read it, Kenny?
You know what? I've read bits of it, but
okay.
I don't think there's anything that Michael Gorman has written that shouldn't be recommended. His reading Revelation responsibly is just,
yeah,
I love that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
Okay, next thing is a food or a meal that you return to.
I have eggs for breakfast almost every morning, and if I were ever to leave academia, God forbid, I would probably start a restaurant just so I could eat at it. And it would probably be focused on eggs of some kind. I can't help myself. All kind of French toast, scrambled, poached, over easy. All the eggs.
Even the deviled eggs.
Yes, because we don't give the devil power over us. It's a theological conviction.
That's right. We eat them for breakfast.
We mash them up. Yeah.
And finally, a place or a location that you return to.
So I was just at a place, a Catholic monastery here in Oregon where I live called Mount Angel Abbey, and it's just gorgeous. It's beautiful. They have great liturgy and rhythms of the Catholic life there, and Protestants can come in and enjoy it for a day or a week. And I was just there, and I go there about once every other year, and it gives me hope for the world again, this beautiful, majestic liturgical environment.
That's wonderful. Okay, now we know you a little bit, so you're free to talk openly.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're going to be talking about your latest book called Strange Religion, how the first Christians were weird, dangerous, and compelling. And just that title alone is enough to make you want to pick the book up.
I hope so.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking a little bit around some of the themes of that today. And I was thinking about this when I was in youth group, in the late 80s and early 90s. The last thing we wanted to be considered was weird. We just did everything that was possible not to be seen as weird. And I wonder, our generation, as we've grown up, that attitude has kind of snuck into the way that we structure our churches and the way that we relate to the world. So maybe you can talk a little bit through kind of what was the motivation behind your writing of this book about a strange religion called Christianity.
That's funny because we're probably around the same age.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a heavily Christian environment in Ohio. And this was the era of DC Talks Jesus freaks. And so this was like, how can we distinguish ourselves by how freaky we are with Jesus rather than how much we blend in? So different context. And actually that whole thing with DC Talk was inspired by Fox's Book of Martyrs. I don't know. We could go down the rabbit hole some other time with that.
Yeah.
Okay, what inspired this? A couple things. Very briefly, I'll mention the academic side, and then I want to turn to the cultural side. So academic side, it was really I wrote a book called Paul and Language of Faith, and there was a question that was asked in a lecture I gave where someone said, you mentioned Christians called themselves believers. Was that distinguished from Romans? Did Romans call themselves believers of various cults like Asclepius or, Artemis or that sort of thing? And so that led me on kind of a research trail. And I came up with nothing. They don't call themselves believers because they just take their beliefs for granted. It's assumed, and therefore it's not stated. So that's weird. And I thought to myself, if Christians were weird in this area, were they weird in other areas? And by weird, I don't mean hairstyles or music taste. I mean like cultural, religious deviance. So I'm using the word weird or strange as a social scientific category. Okay, let's go to the cultural side here. There's a lot of my inspiration for writing this came out of the pandemic here in the United States, especially here in Portland, where you had, lockdown, you had masks, you had people not going to church, and then when things kind of subsided and people could start going back to church, people just stopped going back to church. And now we're seeing some recovery several years later. But when I was writing the book, I was really surprised that there was this. I wasn't surprised, but I noticed that there was this sense that people felt comfortable not going back to church because it didn't seem to really offer much.
Yeah.
It was just this idea of like, there wasn't this like, I gotta get back to church. I gotta be with my people. On top of that, I live in one of the most unchurched environments in the United States. I'm sure, you experienced some of this in the UK. Yeah. And when I talk to my neighbors about Christianity, aside from what they know about Christianity from me, which is hopefully like, he doesn't play loud music at night, and but what they know about Christianity comes from the news, and the news is often bad.
Right.
So it's like Christians are hypocrites. Christians reflect and amplify the worst features of society, American society, like greed, flying around in $86 million jets, narcissism. There's a TV show about wealthy preachers with expensive sneakers, yeah. Like that sort of thing. Sex scandals, embezzlement scandals. I mean, every week, if you listen to the news, there's just all these scandals, hypocrisy, all of this. And to be honest, the news is usually true.
Yeah.
It may be exaggerated, but it too often, let's put it that way, too often it's true. And so when I look at that, I experience such dissonance from my day job, which is to study the New Testament, where I'm seeing a whole different type of Christianity in the first century and early second century AD. Now, I'm clear in my book that Christians then and now weren't perfect. But what I'm amazed by when I read the New Testament is just how socially, culturally, religiously deviant, even morally, the early Christians were. And the question that kept nagging me was, what inspiration it would have taken to march to the beat of a completely different drummer. Kenny, you and I, we're willing to be deviant in a little thing.
Sure.
Like, like I'm not going to listen to the new Taylor Swift album, or, we're willing to kind of dip our toe out into deviance in some small thing.
Sure.
But to do it in virtually every area of life, like, who were these people? And we think about this with the great cultural revolutionists throughout history, people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, not a Christian in the formal sense, but certainly inspired by the Bible. But you think about all these revolutionary leaders of history, and the common denominator is a willingness to not conform to the status quo of society for the sake of some mission or purpose. And these Christians were that. If you read Tom Holland's Dominion, strong impression that life was different before the Christians came along, and we take a lot of those things for granted now. So I really wrote this book to enchant people in a disenchanted age.
Yeah.
I want to inspire people to dream again, Christians to hope again, to dream big dreams, because if our spiritual ancestors did it back then, what's stopping us from doing it now? That's kind of the pitch.
Yeah. And so in order to do that in the book, you take us back to first, second century Roman culture so that we can begin to perceive this contrast of what's going on.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us are maybe ignorant about Roman culture at the time. A lot of the popular culture perceptions of it that we have, we maybe hear a little bit about the gods. We maybe get, the mythologies represented in a movie narrative.
Yeah.
But we don't really see how religion fits into Roman culture in a lot of those depictions. And so maybe firstly we can look at that, about how religion was actually central to Roman culture.
I used to be kind of misled by my understanding of polytheism, because polytheism, the idea of many gods, I think I used to think, okay, if there's this kind of cacophony and plurality of gods, then they can't be that important, because, you could just sort of make one up anytime you want. That wasn't really how the Roman Empire worked. Even though there was a general tolerance policy towards the inclusion of new gods, there was definitely a state religion.
Right.
And in the United States, it's a little confusing because we don't have a state religion per se, but, we kind of do, but the UK does.
Sure, yeah.
UK does have a state religion, and so you might understand this a little bit better, but Rome had its own state religion, which is the Roman gods, Jupiter and Mars and Venus and Pluto and Saturn, all of that, that would correspond to the Greek gods, Zeus and so forth. And even though they allowed for multiple gods, there was definitely a pecking order. So I explained that Roman society functioned like a great pyramid of power, with the most number of humans at the bottom, like bottom feeders, like slaves, criminals, immigrants, so forth. You had a huge, quote unquote, blue collar class. And then you had, as you go up this pyramid, you have fewer number of people with exponentially more power, like the equestrian class, the senatorial class. And at the pinnacle of the human part, you have the emperor, who kind of stood on the kind of line between heaven and earth. But then even above that, you have gods of various ranks and statuses. If you watch Percy Jackson, you have like demigods, and then you have like divinized heroes. And then at the top, you have the great Olympians, and Jupiter, who's like Zeus, would be best and greatest. So there was a clear pecking order. I mean, there was a framework, there was a structure to society. Everybody had their favorite gods, just like sports teams. Do you have one, Kenny, in the UK?
I gave up because being Scottish, it just becomes so disappointing. We lose all the time. But yeah, I watch a lot of football.
Oh, okay. Okay, what about local UK teams, Premier League?
Yeah, I kind of have a soft spot for Liverpool or Manchester United, those guys.
Yeah. Yes. Great. The winning teams. No underdogs for you. Yeah. Totally. And it would be like that way for religion. You have Artemis of the Ephesians, you have Apollos, who is venerated in many big and small cities. But there's clearly this structure. And there was a framework for existence that Romans refer to sometimes as Pax Deorum, which means peace of the gods, and we could explain it as peaceful coexistence with the gods. So these gods, specifically the Roman gods, were viewed as, we often view God as, like in American culture, as like kind of a genie in a bottle, and we rub this magic lamp and poof, and then we ask for some wishes and we hope they'll be granted. But it's very different in the Roman world, where the gods are really seen as cosmic overlords. They're like colonizers.
Yeah.
And so you approach them with fear and trembling and obeisance, submission. And the idea was, if you can get into a network of reciprocity with the gods, you give them submission, sacrifices, worship, appeasement, and maybe you'd be lucky enough to get some kickbacks from them. And woe to anyone that would offend the gods. Like, woe to anybody that would defy them, disobey them, say they don't exist, like that would be as destructive as offending the Roman emperor, if obviously exponentially more, because the gods have that much more power. But the idea that, like, for example, Jews, often tried to accommodate, especially in big cities, especially in their own territories, they tried to accommodate to the Roman ways. And so we have records of them saying, okay, we're not going to sacrifice to Caesar or to the Roman gods, but we'll pray for Rome, and we'll make a sacrifice to our God for Rome, to bless Rome, that sort of thing. That was their form of accommodation. And if you're going to be a respectable religion, you're expected to have certain features like temples, which the Jews had,
Yep.
Or priests, which the Jews had, or sacrifices, which the Jews had. But then the Christians come along, and it'd be like this, Kenny, if I said to you, I'm going to start a restaurant. It's going to be the best. It's going to be a brand new restaurant, best restaurant I've ever had. But we're not going to have tables, chairs, food, servers, or menus. You say, okay, but what is it then? Like,
Yeah.
That's what the Christians did. By the time the temple was destroyed, let's say in 80 AD 80,
Yeah.
81 to make it clear.
Yeah.
Christians didn't have temples, priests, sacrifices, any of those things. I mean, Jews lost their temple as well, but they dreamed of rebuilding it. They dreamed of a day when it was rebuilt, and Christians said, no, we have the Holy Spirit, all these things. That just made them different, and because they were different in those specific ways, it made them dangerous.
So actually, religion then is not a side thing in Roman culture. It actually informs,
Central.
holds the whole of Roman society, and the idea of success, the success of Rome, is all revolved around this reciprocity with the gods, this hierarchical system.
Yeah, every area of life, the gods were involved. It was business, commerce, government, entertainment, education, every area of life. The gods were central. I'm writing a story. I don't know if you've come across this, but I'm writing a fictional story called Strange Encounter. Have you seen this yet?
No, I haven't seen it yet, no.
Oh, I gotta send it to you.
Yeah.
It's being published in a serialized form through a magazine. We have about 6 episodes out, and it's trying to imagine what it would have been like for a pagan, a Roman, to meet a Christian in kind of middle late first century, and just how dumbfounded they would be by all the backward ways of Christians from a Roman worldview, from a Roman perspective. And so it's about this Roman named Felix meeting a Christian named Hermes, and just that sense of, on the one hand, fascination, like what are you all about, and at the same time, like, danger, like we shouldn't be talking about this.
Yeah.
Like people could be listening. Like I think that would have been realistic, that what Christians were doing wasn't just arguing over a hobby, but talking about the very central aspects of politics, religion, and real life. And this is extremely dangerous. This got Polycarp killed, right? This got Paul stoned and thrown out of, half the cities that he was in. Obviously got Jesus executed. So this was really serious business. And it has much to do with religion as it did with politics.
In Rome, other religions could be accepted as long as you accommodated to the Roman ideals of what a religion was.
Yes.
Christianity seemed to then just kind of contradict that on almost every level, would not play the game, and was labeled as kind of a depraved and excessive superstitio or superstition.
Yeah.
It's in some regards.
Yeah.
In comparison, can we dig a little bit into how was Christianity so deviant, as you say, from kind of Roman expectations of what a religion would be?
Yeah, I mean, the first place to start is this notion of the supremacy of Jesus. I tried to not use Christianese in the book so I could make it disorienting. I could kind of make you think about it in a new way. So I talk about the supremacy of Jesus. Now, if Jupiter's best and greatest, which was one of his most common titles, what are the Christians saying when they say Jesus is kurios? And what's interesting is I was fascinated by the early Christian phrase Lord of all, or Lord of heaven and earth. And I just assumed that corresponded to Zeus or corresponded to the emperor. What's really interesting is prior to the first century, you didn't really find gods referred to as Lord of all. They were very territorial.
Right.
So you had the gods of Rome, or the gods of, the Thracians, or the gods of, but this idea of Lord of all, my argument in the book, and I don't trace this out really strongly. But my argument in the book is, as the Roman Empire started to get ambitious and wanted to take over the world, they started to rethink the world as theirs. And when they did that, then only in the really first century and second century did you start to see kind of an amalgamation of this allness language. And so then you start to see the emperor think of himself as Lord of all, and therefore these gods over them must also be Lord of all. So this is part of what I think Paul meant when he said at the right time, at the fateful time, God sent his son. All sorts of things go into that. I think part of that is that moment in the Roman imperial history where Rome starts to make totalizing claims. That now you have this son of man born on earth to challenge that with his own totalizing claims. It would have made, let me put it this way, it would have made less sense a century earlier. None of it really made sense, but it wouldn't have had such a strong counterpart.
Sure.
Put it that way.
Yeah.
And so I would say the first claim that would have really been a throwing down of the gauntlet would be the lordship of Christ.
Yeah.
The supremacy of Christ, that this person is dominant, is sovereign over all heaven and earth.
And I love how, like, Scott McKnight in his Second Testament translates kingdom as empire to emphasize that claim, right?
Basileia. Yeah.
Yeah.
The first time I heard that was from John Dominic Crossan, and he had translated kingdom of God as empire of God.
Yeah.
And it just kind of makes the hair stand up on, your arms or the back of your neck, because you're like, ooh, that's kind of icky.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I got into an argument with an academic recently because I used the translation Commonwealth in Philippians 3, where it says, our citizenship is in heaven. Politeia, I translate as Commonwealth. And he pushed back and he said, that's going to strike people as too imperialistic. I'm like,
Yeah.
It is imperialistic. Like, in the same way, just like you would say, Kenny, kingdom is imperialistic.
Yep.
Lordship, king, lord, all those are imperialistic.
Yep.
And so these Christians just boldly just saying these things. I mean, it helps us better understand the book of Acts, that when Paul goes in the middle of the square and starts saying these things, of course people are going to get upset.
Right.
He's turned the world upside down. He's proclaiming another king other than Caesar. He's saying things that are unlawful to Romans. All the pieces just started to come together once I started to study Roman religion and understand that if you're a Roman colony seeking the favor of Rome, wanting taxation benefits, wanting to make sure that the gods don't, send pestilence on your land, you have one easy rule: don't offend the gods. Don't offend the gods. It's an easy rule.
Right.
And there's a great story that I share in my book about the Romans attacking the Tyrians, the people of Tyre. And when the Romans come along, you should be scared. And so the Tyrians are so afraid that their god Apollos is going to abandon them, they tie down the statue of Apollos with gold chains, so the statue doesn't fly away. I mean, this isn't just jewelry.
Yeah.
This is life and death.
Yeah.
And here the Christians are stomping in and saying, we have a different way of looking at religion. I mean, it's unfathomable.
And what about the sense of the hierarchy, the elitism,
right,
the kind of access and different layers that you have? Christianity seems to kind of undermine that whole system as well.
They do. I was just teaching on this over the last couple weekends where, we talk about this pyramid of power, and the whole idea of the Roman society is people at the bottom do everything they can to go up that pyramid or up that ladder. So, Joseph Hellerman talks about this as the cursus honorum, the route of gaining glory and honor. And so you stomp and you fight and you compete so that you can get a little bit higher on that list. This is where we get I am of Paul, I am of Apollos. You have this competitive activity, which was extremely common in Roman society, in order to prove yourself more superior. And we see this replicated in the world of the gods. So I talk in my book about Hesiod's famous hymn called the Theogony, which is kind of a genealogy of the Greek gods, but it's really a contest of power between the Greek gods. So real briefly, the first, primordial deity mentioned is Uranus, and Uranus' son Kronos conspires with his mother to overthrow Uranus and kill him. And then they have a son, Zeus, and Zeus conspires with his mother to overthrow Cronus. And then Zeus is paranoid about, his children and so on forth. And it begins what's called the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and Olympians. Again, all this is in Percy Jackson, if anyone wants to look it up. The great battle. And this is Roman and Greek culture. It's power, it's competition, it's subversion, it's domination, it's classism, it's fear, it's hatred, all those. I mean, these are what these great stories are about from Greek antiquity. It's, there's some compassion and love and, let's help out Odysseus. But on the God side, I mean, very little nobility and a lot of subversion. Then you have something like the Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2. And I actually think that Paul writes this ode to Jesus thinking about an inversion of something like Hesiod's Theogony. He may not have had that specific story in mind, but this idea of Father and Son in perfect unity, seeking obedience to God, going down, humbling himself, lowering self, willingness to die. The subtext, love isn't mentioned, but the subtext is love. This establishes a completely different culture, because the Christian way moves away from a competitive economy to an unlimited economy. It's as much an economic shift as it is a religious shift. This idea that, like Paul says to the Romans, the subtext is don't compete with each other, but he actually says outdo one another in showing the other person honor. That was not the Roman way. Right. And so I think this would have been one of the things that made Christianity attractive, especially people at the bottom of that pyramid, is they say, we have no hope in this world. We have no opportunity for upward mobility to better our lives. And then these Christians say, hey, we're going to offer these things to you, and there's no catch. There's just generosity. There's just love. And why wouldn't that have sparked a revolution?
Yeah, the greatest among you must be the servant.
Yeah.
Right?
First and last.
Yeah.
All this was kind of shadow scripting, an opposition of the Roman way.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things I researched for the book was a speech, a letter that Pliny writes to a up-and-coming governor named Tiro. And he says to Tiro, he gives him some advice about his career. He says to Tiro, you need to learn from the mistakes of other people, because many other people in your situation, they're going to want to cozy up to their inferiors in order to be popular, but then you're going to mistake who's in which class. So, and then he makes this famous statement, Pliny does. He says, the most unequal thing is the appearance of equality where there is none. And what he's saying is, within a class in that pyramid, there can be equality, but between classes, there can't be. And if you try to do that, it will invite chaos. And here you have the Christians with this famous phrase that's throughout the whole New Testament, God is no respecter of persons, meaning God does not distinguish one person from the next in terms of importance or status. I mean, that is the most un-Roman thing in the whole Bible.
Yeah.
That right there. And it's repeated by James and Paul and in Jesus and other forms. Quite incredible.
We could get the impression that kind of the Christians have decided we're going to establish this like just contrarian religion just to annoy Rome.
Utopian.
And you've got this Celsus snippy quote where he says, if all men wanted to be Christians, the Christians would no longer want them, right? They're just contrary.
Backwards, yeah.
But obviously, it's actually out of a life centered around Christ that these practices come, and they just happen to be contrary to the ways of the empire, because the ways of Christ are contrary to the ways of the empire.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, John Barclay, who I'm sure you know there in the UK, he's made some important points about the political nature of early Christianity. The Christians weren't out picketing. They weren't out, writing letters to their senators or their MPs. Paul doesn't name political leaders. He doesn't criticize them in his letters. So Paul is really focused on cultivating an alternative community within the church, spiritual community that's also, just and equal and that sort of thing. But it's really, there's a lot of these discussions in my field about what did evangelism look like for the early Christians? Were they out, handing out tracts of the 4 spiritual laws door to door? No, they weren't. Were they trained in evangelism? Not in the ways that we sometimes do. But I think a lot of it would be welcoming people into their community. This is interesting, and I've been just doing more research on this after I wrote the book. 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about outsiders that are inside the church, and he refers to them as idiotes. It doesn't mean idiots. It means people who are on their own, meaning they're not technically integrated into the community. So they're kind of like, in soccer United States, if someone is practicing with a team, but they're not with the team, and then they're kind of trying out, but they're doing it over multiple weeks, they call them trialists. Do they have that in the UK?
Yep, absolutely.
So these are almost trialists in the church, these idiotes.
Okay.
They're on their own, but they're not on their own, because Paul says, okay, when you have prophecies, make sure they're interpreted for the idiotes. When things are going on that are going to be confusing, make sure they're making sense to the idiotes. So there's almost this like observation deck, which offers some level of engagement. So I think that the early Christians, like you were hinting at, wanted to practice their new world in their communities, but they wanted to attract people into that space. Now you have the apostles who are going out there, but they're technically sent out. I mean, they're sent out from those communities to do that. And so I think the revolution was meant to be a kind of inside out revolution. We're going to do this by bringing people in to change them. And then they're going to go out and change their communities. I mean, I think that's the strategy when Paul's traveling around, baptizing people like Stephanas and Gaius and Achaicus. I mean, he's baptizing householders, people who can bring these messages to their communities.
I think a horrible conclusion after reading your book would be to come away saying, okay, let's get weird.
Depends on what you mean. But yes, I know what you're saying.
It's like weirdness for the sake of weirdness.
Yeah.
But actually, it's more to do with this rerouting ourselves in the person of Christ.
Yes.
Exhibiting faithfulness to his ways in the world.
Yes.
That's going to naturally be unnatural.
Yeah, the weirdness is going to be an effect,
yeah.
not a cause. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what would be interesting to kind of finish on here is not so much on what do we need to do as the church, which I think we've already kind of hinted at in this idea of the community and the the gathered expression of a community who are following after the ways of Christ. But I think what would be interesting for our listeners would be to say, we obviously can't be transported back to the 1st and 2nd century, and the gospel is not stuck there.
No.
It goes across eras and cultures. But there is something about understanding the context in which the early church was functioning that can maybe work as an interpretive lens for how we then communicate who we are and who Jesus is to the world around us. Could we maybe talk about this idea of understanding the historical context and its importance?
I get the question a lot of what empowered them to be so resilient in the face of their own cultural context. And the way I look at it is when a person or community comes to Christ and they want to follow Christ, I think what happens sometimes is that they start with the world as it is, and then they just try to move a little bit towards Christ. They're starting with the world.
Yeah.
And then they're trying to say, how can we inch closer to Jesus? And they sometimes make it and sometimes don't. And I think what made the earliest Christians different in their best moments and amongst the best communities was, I talk about this in terms of the parable of the pearl of great price. So the pearl of great price, I feel like the early Christians, they were willing to let go of everything to obtain the pearl, which is Christ, in my analogy. To obtain the pearl. And, this is a lot like Philippians 3, where Paul says, I was the best amongst Jews. I had all the credentials, but I suffered the loss of all things. And I think what they did, what they were inspired to do in that first century was reevaluate everything in light of Christ and then put the pieces back together with Christ at the center. So I think about like 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, even though we used to know Christ kata sarka, according to the flesh, we know him no longer. And now we know no one any longer, or nothing any longer, kata sarka, according to the flesh. So it's this kind of comprehensive reevaluation of all things in light of being in Christ. Paul says, I long to know Christ, the power of his resurrection, so forth. So I think what we're called to do is basically take everything apart. And it doesn't mean it's full rejection of everything. Like, Paul was still Jewish at the end of it all.
Yeah.
But he evaluated his Jewishness in light of Christ. Paul didn't swear off politics. I mean, he engaged with, all these magistrates in the book of Acts, but he reevaluated politics in light of Christ. I think this is getting at what you're asking in terms of how does reading a book like mine help us to read the New Testament differently? I mean, this is kind of, what I sometimes refer to my students as absolute Christology. Absolute Christology is Christianity can't just be getting together on Sunday with good friends. It can't just be good habits for great living. It really has to be a whole new person in Christ. I mean, I just ended up teaching for a week here at a retreat on Galatians, and this is what Paul says in Galatians chapter 2. I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live.
Yeah. Sometimes
with a penal substitution or exchange sort of approach, we think, okay, great, phew, I don't have to go to hell, I can go to heaven. But read Galatians 2. I mean, Paul says, I am crucified and I no longer live. The old person, the old me is dead. And now Christ has brought to life a new me in me. And now I live a new kind of symbiotic or hybrid life with Christ in the body, in life. That's what made the difference. The weirdness is an outer working of that new person in me with Christ in me. And to the degree to which we can help people and churches to think in those terms, then we are doing right by our spiritual ancestors.
Reevaluating everything in the light of Christ. I love that. And feels like something we need to be doing a lot of right now at the moment.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated the book, Nijay, and the way that, although you're taking us back to this first and second century culture, the other side of my brain was echoing with everything that's happening in our world at the moment as well, and how those things are interconnected. So I would recommend anybody pick up a copy of Strange Religion by Nijay Gupta, work your way through it, and lots for us to think about. Appreciate your time, Nijay. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Kenny and Nijay, for showing us that being weird as Christians is about living a completely countercultural life that challenges cultural norms and not just being someone who is a bit wacky. It is so true that the context of the early church can teach us about our world today, and our hope is that we can live our lives in a similar way. In our next episode, Kenny is joined by Rev Dr Dennis Edwards, who will be talking about our need to rediscover a much misunderstood, avoided, or even forgotten virtue: humility. TheoDisc is part of WTC, a theological college that seeks to partner with the church through equipping and sending out the whole people of God. Our innovative hub model allows you to study any of our part-time programs without leaving your work or ministry. Find out more at wtctheology.org.uk. Thank you for listening to episode 38 of TheoDisc. Join us next time for episode 39 with Dennis Edwards as we look at the virtue of humility. Bye for now.